All right. Thank you, everyone. Do you all know about this technique as a thing? Yeah. Excellent. Okay, so for the nose, very briefly then, it's a really handy way to bring together groups without shouting at them or interrupting them mid-flow. It kind of says, hey, I'm ready to talk when you all come back together. And so slowly you see the hands spreading, and then you know everyone's ready, so they don't get interrupted. I remember seeing this at an Agile keynote a long time ago and thinking it was just the best mind trick ever. And I went home and showed my kids, and they said, we do that at Guides and Cubs all the time. So there we go. So thank you for coming back together. Thank you for your patience as well. And I trust that in addition to meeting the person next to you, you now pretty much know their life story as well. Let's try and do the presentation, which might be quick. If I'm going to try and cram it all in, if I'm going too quick, you'll have to, again, raise your hands or shout. And similarly, if you can't hear me, especially at the back, please let me know. Something like this is good, or other forms of feedback are available. All right. So, as you know then, my talk is about cognitive biases from the preamble. Cognitive biases are present in us all, as we know. But what we're going to talk about today is really three things, right? We're going to talk about the washing up. We're going to talk about IKEA. Hey, and we're going to talk about Lego, which I hope is what you all came for. So I asked you earlier if you had a bias. I could ask it again and test the speed of learning in this room. Who's got a bias? Hey, I think there's some stalwarts who are still saying they don't. If you have a bias, you have a brain. And if you've got a brain, you've got a bias, right? Blind spot bias, as I mentioned before the slides worked, is this tendency to see oneself as less biased than other people and not to identify our own biases. So I'll skim through this one. Let me illustrate this with an example. How many phone numbers can you actually remember right now? Did someone say loads? So really? So that's brilliant. So I hope you don't mind me saying that you're quite unique in that. But it's a great example of why we need to reach out for inclusivity and diversity of thinking styles, right? Because despite how we look, we all think in different ways. So thank you for bringing that. Generally, in the population, we can remember 2 or 3 numbers, right? We'll remember the first number we had to learn. Maybe, so in my day, that was the number of the landline at home. We'll remember our mobile number, and then there'll be one other important number, something that matters to us, like the number of your ISP, because your broadband keeps going down, that sort of thing. Just 3 numbers. So why is that? This is often called we've done that already. This is often called the Google Effect, or digital amnesia. And essentially, if we know where to get a piece of information, we don't bother storing it. The other thing you might do, and I'm not going to do a show of hands on this, you might actually store information in other people. You might rely on other people for certain types of information. You can save your energy, save your brain energy. So what we're going to do today then, we're going to raise awareness of biases. We're going to understand a little bit about how they occur. We'll go right from the basics, because I'm not a psychologist. I've been on this learning journey too, so I'll share what I've found. See how they affect our work, and look at some techniques to reduce their influence. The number of techniques will vary depending on the amount of time I spend on the theory stuff. What I hope not to do then is cause doubt in your every decision. And as a bonus, I also hope not to undermine your confidence in all the other speakers that will go after me. So why have we got these biases, right? I've been painting a picture of them as being not entirely helpful. The first thing is the need for speed of thinking. So let's imagine that I'm in my lovely hometown of Bristol. I've been out for an Agile meetup, and I'm walking home in an advanced state of refreshment. I go down to the subway in a dodgy area, and I see these people. What am I going to do? I've got run too right. I got seconds to decide, right? You know, are they local louts who are going to steal my Post-its and Sharpies, or are they like an indie band hanging around for a photo shoot? It's really not worth me deliberating that. And you know, we talked about the primeval concepts earlier. This is a bit like lion comes out of the cupboard. We've got to decide immediately what to do. We cannot hang around. The safest thing to do is to react quickly. And this is where a lot of our biases come from. We don't want to take a chance. The bias will kick in and mobilize us quickly. The next one is the amount of data. So have a look at this scene, right? There's a lot going on here. Even without interpreting it, we can probably see little information about there's umbrellas, there's lots of lights, you've probably made a conclusion about where it is. But there's a lot to take in just in this simple street scene. And we illustrated this a bit, I hope, in an ad hoc way earlier when we said, right, let's look at the room and see if we notice anything new. You came in, your brain pattern matched, it's a room, not going to look too hard. You filtered a lot of information to save your brain's processing power. But then in that, data is meaning, and that's even harder. And actually, I think this is probably a better example of looking for meaning, because you've got the data, you've got the raw data, facts, right? Umbrella, it's pink. There are buildings, there are people. But you're also looking for meaning in this, and you could spend forever trying to figure out what's going on in here. The country, is it shopping? The culture, are people happy or sad? You know, with this one, which is obviously flight paths, there's meaning beyond the data. Why is this bit black? Is it an ocean, or is it an area of a developing country that doesn't have airports yet? All of this takes energy. It takes mental energy, mental stamina, but it also burns glucose. It burns up our physical resources that we share with the rest of our body, with our physical actions. So biases are trying to protect us. And the last thing, you know, we've got all this data, which we can choose to interpret. We can invest time trying to understand it and find a meaning for us. But then what if we choose to remember things? Well, our brains are only so big. And so we need to be selective about what we store. And our biases try to help us store the stuff that matters. But as we'll see later, sometimes they're a bit lazy or a bit sensationalist, frankly. And we saw this with digital amnesia. You know, when I talked about the phone numbers, that's your brain saying, you don't need to store it, so don't. What I'll do is just take up a small amount of space with remembering how to find the thing, which for any programmers is exactly like a pointer. All right, so that's where our biases come from. That's how they're trying to help us then. They're trying to conserve our brain energy. Here's a way to think about them. So have a look at this picture. It's probably familiar, and that's fine. Okay? What did you see? Dog lying down? Man's head? Man's head?
The lady wearing a dress.
Okay. Fingers. Yeah. So all these are true. Hey. So there's meaning, right? Great example. We had everyone saying data, and you've got the meaning. So you instinctively saw certain patterns. You pattern matched and anchored on certain things in the picture. If we look at it again, can you see some of the interpretations that other people saw? So every time I show this, and I think it's only like the third, someone comes up with something new that I hadn't spotted. But the main thing is that the biases are working like this. And so, so if we recognize in ourselves that we have a propensity to see certain things, think in certain styles, and match or focus on certain patterns, just like you did when you first saw the image, we can encourage ourselves and our teams, if we wish, to look at things again and look for more and look differently. And that's how it all works. And that is the best mediation for recognizing biases and taking advantage of them, but also knowing when they're not helping us. So, shall we have a look at some more biases? The illusion of control. Here's a classic, right? When we are... have any of you heard of Waterfall or Prince 2? I am... Prince 2? Shall we talk afterwards? So, I think that very much maligned. But of course, what they're aiming for is to try and bring comfort. Comfort in very uncertain and high-risk situations. And In Agile, I think we're always comparing the best of Agile methods against the worst of conventional project management methods, which I think is not very helpful. Done badly, though, conventional project management will tend to focus on the illusion of control and trying to control things that it might not be necessary to control, or trying to produce a lot of artifacts to help us control. So that's one that we're always up against. Now, in planning poker, does anyone know why we would tend to vote, work out our vote, and then show our vote simultaneously when we're sizing stuff? Everyone's perception is different, right? It's also about a thing called anchoring, whereby, have you heard of this one? Because what I'd like to do is to skim through all the ones you know and get to the ones you maybe aren't so familiar with. So basically, there's a concept called anchoring, whereby if someone has influence or is admired, or unfortunately simply considered to be attractive in the room, people will tend to follow their steer. So if we hold up a 3 for the estimate, you're suddenly going to get a load of 3s. The bonkers thing about anchoring is there's a repeatable experiment where people are asked to price a bottle of wine. Before they're asked to price the bottle of wine, they're asked to recite the last 2 digits of their phone number. If those last 2 digits are low, price is low. If the last 2 digits are high, price is high. We sort of anchor around these terms. This is super important if you're going into a negotiating situation, because generally the first figure that's said will determine the figure that is negotiated around. In other words, if someone says 500 quid, you're unlikely to say no, 1,000, and then negotiate around that. That's why we get all of this let's split the difference stuff. So in planning poker then, we deliberately hide if we're estimating, and let's not go into no estimate stuff as yet. So we deliberately hide what we're going to say to avoid anchoring, to avoid groupthink. And it's another part of the Agile recipe that we need to be mindful of. Here's an example of it. It's called the Ash conformity experiment. Be careful how you look this one up. Basically what they did, first of all, let's do a quiz. So look at line X. I would like you to put your hand up for which line you think is the same length as line X. So is it A? Is it B? One for B. Is it C? All right. So in this experiment, what they did was to ask someone to come into a room with a group of people who were talking about the length of the line. The only issue is the participant, the person coming into the room, was surrounded by actors who were all told to say a different line to the true length. And what they found is graphed here, and it's pretty interesting. When they only had one opponent, as in one person who disagreed about the length of the line, the participant, the person that came into the room, would tend to argue and tend to put up a fight and say, no, that's not right, look, it looks like these are different lengths. But then, as the number of people that agreed about the length of the line, the wrong length of the line, so the actors, increases, the likelihood of the participant pushing back and saying, no, that line is definitely not the same length, reduces. The really spooky thing about this is that at its peak, which is 37.1%, happens at 7, our magic number for an Agile team. So this is groupthink in action, and this is repeatable across many cultures, many environments, and in many different guises. Now, it's still only 40% error, but that's significant, right? If you're running a meeting once, if you're making a decision about something only once, and you know that groupthink is going to kick in about 40% of the time, you really want to think carefully about it. So for stand-ups then, the next in-line effect, I love this one, and I'm sure you've all noticed this, it's especially acute on a Monday morning. You know, essentially, you're busy thinking about what you're going to say or trying to remember desperately what you did 2 minutes ago. And therefore, you don't remember what the person before you says, and you don't remember what the person after you says. What I've been trying to find is if the use of talking tokens and talking balls, throwing them around and randomizing the order reduces this. So if anyone hears anything about that, I'd love to hear. All right. So the next one I find really interesting is, anyone hungry? It's called the unit bias. The unit bias says that we like to consume things in units, in discrete pockets. So, slice of cake, right? When you get cake in the cafe, has that cake been sliced by the waiter or waitress to meet exactly your dietary needs, the amount of cake you would like to consume, and to help you balance your health? Probably not. It is just a slice. It is just a unit. But you're going to eat it anyway, right? You get a full plate of food, you'll probably get through that. Get a smaller plate, you'll still get through that. Think about a chocolate bar. We eat chocolate bars in units. Actually, that's more about marketing. That's more about what they can sell for a price point and make look good in packaging. It's not about the optimum amount of chocolate that we need. It's making me so hungry. It's not about the optimum amount of chocolate that we need to get our chocolate fix. So the unit bias then that we tend to consume in units is really important for something that we all love. Kanban. What is Kanban about? What is breaking things down small, as we do in things like continuous delivery as well? We're trying to create units that we will want to consume, want to finish. So it's playing to a bias. This is using a bias in a positive way. There's an interesting time management technique where if you have a task that you know you need to split, say for lunch, you should kind of split it sort of in the middle or 3/4 through, then take your lunch and then get back to it, rather than trying to push on to finish it. Because then your brain is interrupted and it craves completion. It wants to go back to the thing. The unit bias is saying, let me finish, let me finish. The other nefarious one related to this is a thing called the sunk cost fallacy, which is where if we've invested time in something, we want to get a return on that. We want to keep investing. So anyone who has at any time in their life had an old car or an old bike, they know they should have replaced it, but they just keep throwing more money in, more money, more money. That is the sunk cost fallacy. Really, the smarter thing to do would be to just accept the loss and carry on. But again, this works with Kanban. Let's talk about retrospectives then. So, Darby and Larson, this is what they say. I'm sure you're all familiar with this. It's underneath every retro, and it works. Well, it's underneath the majority of the formats, and it works fantastically until people come into the room. And then what you see is this influence. And I have literally seen retrospectives that unconsciously have been set up to blame or target a single person. It's terrifying. So influence, gather opinions and judgments, not data. If you put up a timeline, which we all know is a pretty good, reliable way of finding out what's happening in a team, but the events that come out, they'll be the most recent, the most striking. They won't be genuine data. And so, of course, when we're thinking about Kanban, this is important because we like to bring metrics into the room as well. Generate assumptions, not insights. Let's just think of some things we might do. Decide what to do, and then continue as you were. So really bear this in mind next time you're running a retro. Think about what's in the room. Think about the biases that are coming in. This is from this chap, Jared Shiva. It's a fantastic post about biases and their effect on Agile. If I'd found it earlier, I don't think I would even have written this presentation. I would have just said, go and look at this blog, and we could all go for coffee. So here's another one. This is something I see a lot. A person says, I believe in Agile principles, but I also believe people need close supervision. In DevOps, we see the one that goes, in DevOps, everyone has the pager. Everyone can be interrupted at any time of night and any time in the weekend to deal with an incident. I don't want the pager. So what do? I mean, this is cognitive dissonance. This is a really good thing to look for, particularly when you're introducing practices and trying to help people to change or encouraging something. Dissonance is a difficult decision. It's like a lose-lose type decision, although win-win is just as hard for us. It causes bias because we just can't decide between options. So what does the person do who's having this conflict? Well, generally, they'll hit something else. Facebook, BBC News, do the washing up. Constructive procrastination, right? I don't want to answer this hard question. Brain says that takes too much energy. Distract self. And I'm sure you all recognize the terrible thing. As soon as you've done the washing up or read every Facebook update for the last 6 years, the problem's still there. It hasn't gone away. All your brain has done is buy you time. In another psychological experiment, which is difficult to look up, this is Burden's ass. Now, this is not an experiment, thankfully, but it illustrates it beautifully and is the kind of thing that you can take to a party without talking about agile methods. Essentially, the ass gets to the top of the hill. It is both hungry and thirsty and sadly on the verge of death. On one side it sees tasty straw that it could go and eat, but over here it sees water. It's in need of both. Unable to decide which to go for first, it just keels over. Dissonance. Similarly, in our brains, here's two lovely phones. We are likely to get into a state of cognitive dissonance when choosing between phones, because we can never really truly comprehend the complexity of them, the difference that the hardware will make, the difference that the user interface will make. So we'll make an easier decision. Do I like the brand? Do I like the ecosystem? And then we might also spend a bunch of time justifying that decision. Information bias. I'm still not quite comfortable with my decision, so what I'll do is I'll spend ages researching to try and help make that decision, but I already know what I'm going to do. Another good one to watch for. You probably already know what to do and know what your decision is going to be quite quickly. You might be familiar with the term bike shedding when they were designing nuclear power plants in up north, I'll go for. They were minuting the meetings and they looked at the amount of time that was spent talking about certain topics. The topic that got a surprising and insane percentage of the conversation was the bike sheds, not the safety, not security, because those are hard problems. Bike sheds are easy. Everyone knows about them as well. Everyone can join in with that conversation and the meeting feels very productive, but it's not the valuable thing. All right, so anyone made anything from IKEA recently? So there's a thing called the IKEA Effect, and this is significant for development teams. It's significant because we really value things that we've made ourselves. And the experiment that was conducted, again, repeatable, they got people to value, for instance, an IKEA chair that had already been made by someone else. Then they said, go and make one up. And then they got them to value their own chair. Lo and behold, the value of the own identical chair was considerably more than the one made by someone else. If you're working with technology or product teams, it means you've got to overcome this bias to encourage change. People will be inflating, subconsciously, the worth of their own output. And so gathering data, doing user research, finding techniques to look critically at things that you're appraising is incredibly significant. And while we're on the subject of innovation, anyone got any of these? This is Dine Inc. This is the convenient way to eat your snacks at your desk. Simply, or what about these? These are finger forks. Or there's this, chopsticks. Sorry, those are fork sticks. And there's even, I discovered, these kind of tongs for eating chicken wings, which just go on your thumbs like that. And I suspect these are all an example of this bias, the pro-innovation bias. Optimism towards new things, optimism towards inventions. This is why we often see in tech, a thing will be tried, there'll be a glitch, or it won't work quite as well as we liked. And the solution, rather than putting more effort into evaluating that thing, is to reach out for something new, to favour the innovation, to favour the unknown. I'm sure anyone who's done transformation is familiar with this. You'll go in and try a method, maybe it won't get traction, maybe it won't work so well, and everyone will go, that's rubbish, it doesn't work, we'll never do it again. Rather than, come on, let's push through this, let's retrospect, figure out what's happening, and try again. This bias makes us want to keep moving, which is obviously great in some circumstances, but it does lead to kind of reduced persistence as well. All right, so when we're hiring then, biases are particularly dangerous. Hiring people that don't compete with our own strengths. You know, the mantra I use is you should always try and hire smarter than you. Maybe that's easy. But the point is you're raising the organizational IQ by bringing in people that would challenge you and keep you on your toes. But actually our tendency is not to. We tend not to hire threatening. We tend not to hire people that don't look like us. And similarly, this one, homosocial reproduction, hiring in our own image. This is ridiculous. This is where this is the bias that causes a lot of our challenges with inclusivity. Because essentially, we are looking for candidates that are similar to us and in our own image. That's thing one. But then we also have our stereotypes. So if you could summon up in your head a minute your image of a web developer. And then imagine that you get a CV that comes along from someone whose name, let's say they put a photo on it as well. The name and photo looks nothing like the stereotype you've just summoned up, right? Immediately you're looking at that one more carefully because it doesn't match your pattern. You have to think more about it. And unfortunately, you're likely to be slightly biased against that one. So of course there's lots of things we can do. We can anonymize CVs. They were doing this in a company. They found it reasonably successful, but they found the biases were still getting through and still hiring in their own image. They looked into it and they found that basically the CV would come in for a developer. They would go stalking online, which I'm sure none of us have ever done, go to GitHub, see the person's work, lo and behold, photo and profile. So that company then wrote a GitHub anonymizer, which is brilliant. So it takes away the photos, takes away anything that references gender or place, and generally tries to make that CV just about experience and skill rather than the person's holding it. And then they folded that back into GitHub, which is brilliant. And these are the kind of things that help push back against our biases and help raise awareness of them. This one's just brilliant. It's sadly not that relevant to Agile. So in the supermarkets, you know, if you want to go and buy some item, you will often see a bewildering array of deals. And this is because we're not great at, here's product A, here's product B, which do I choose? Again, we've got that dissonance going on. So they deploy option 3, which is a decoy to make one of the others look obvious. And unfortunately, we fall for it every time. If you've ever been somewhere and looked at the deals and then thought, you have to be a crazy person to go with that, that's what they want you to think. They know which product they want you to buy. They shape another deal. The deal is deliberately designed to look bad, so you prefer the other product, the one they want you to buy. I think it would be deeply nefarious to use this in Agile, so I'm not going to talk about that at all. All right. So I really need to get a move on now. Let's have a look inside biases. Here's a brain, completely accurate representation. If you were to all remove the tops of your skulls, this is exactly what you would see. The brain is divided into 2, except it's not really. But what we do is we recognize that there are essentially, so they're called dual process theories, and there are many of them. And they recognize that there's a front bit of the brain that deals with fight or flight and immediate reaction, and the things I talked about earlier with regard to the speedy thoughts when information comes in. And then there's a more reasoned second part of the brain that deals with the heavy lifting, the hard work. So that's the thing that is probably a lot of you have got engaged now because you're thinking, whether you're thinking about this or something else, there's effortful thought. So this is Daniel Kahneman. He won the Nobel Prize. Has anyone heard of this book? Hands up if you heard of it. Thank you. Who's read it? Finished it? Brilliant. Thank you very much. These are rare people who have finished it. It is hard work, but it... Sorry? But it... Brilliant. So the audiobook then. Yeah. Why didn't I do that? So it's hard work, but very rewarding. It's tiny font, a lot to read. Him and his partner, thought partner, popularized the idea of System 1 and System 2 for thinking. And then from that, they were able to draw out that biases live over here and that the System 1 is protecting the back brain, which is slower. And as I said, there's all of these dual process theories. There's lots of them. Lizard brain you might have heard of. This is the chimp paradox, which describes the same thing in a slightly more digestible way. None of them are right and none of them are wrong, because they're just systems for thinking about thinking. We can't carve up the brain and see a little bit that's labelled system 1 and a little bit that's labelled system 2. You seem like a learned crowd, so what I'd like to do is to introduce my own dual process theory, which is the Mighty Boosh theory. Have you all vaguely heard of this? Just check in. If you haven't, it's a surreal comedy with these two protagonists, which we will learn about later. So Vince then, as you know, he's fashionable, he's always running around. He's the guy that took a Jacobean rough on a holiday, just in case they came into fashion when he got back. And he is like System 1, he's like a front brain, right? Very reactive, loves stories, easily entertained by that. It's impulsive. Everything he does seems to be effortless. And again, that's the important thing about System 1. It doesn't take much energy, but then it doesn't do maths. It's prone to be swayed by emotion, and is quite error prone, but is also very creative. Howard, on the other side, as our System 2, our back brain, acts slowly, very into facts, very into data. Reflective, but because of the depth of thought and the different places those thoughts go, it's tiring. Gets maths, really gets maths. Is analytical, generally reliable, but of course reliant on recall of facts, and very logical. And what we see in the Mighty Boosh, which I will in future years pretend is a documentary, Vince is always running around, everyone wants to talk to him first, and he fronts, just like System 1, he fronts a lot of the conversations and acts as an interface to Howard. And that is the role of System 1. The more scientific version from Jonathan Haidt is that System 2, up the top here, is not unlike the rider of the elephant and thinks that he is in control of the larger System 1. Is he in control?
Until the elephant changes its mind.
Till the elephant changes his mind, yeah. Until it sees prey, sees a mate, gets scared. And this is a fine metaphor. And it gets worse when you get tired. You know, it's worth noting these things aren't always in equilibrium. They aren't always productive. When you get tired, System 1 will do more work. And that's why we're rubbish when we haven't slept well. Hello, parents. Right, are you keeping up? Because Jonathan Smallwood says this: mind wandering may enhance creativity by increasing the likelihood of non-conscious associative processing. In other words, if you have used this as an opportunity to daydream, well done. System 1 is just idling away, it's meandering about, it's looking through your mind palace, and in doing, it's making connections that it wouldn't normally do. System 2 at the back, with all of its very data and analytical processing style, is unlikely to make those random connections. It's like the person that everyone knows at the conference who just goes around connecting people, Gladwell's connectors. And this happens when we daydream. Brilliant. I don't have time to tell you about Edison's balls, but if you want to hear about that later, I will tell you. Do come and see me. So working with biases then, what can we do? So the first thing is data. Edward Deming, have you all heard of Deming? Okay. So it's interesting the characters that the various sort of agile and lean movements pick up on. DevOps, where I kind of came from, they love Deming. He revitalized manufacturing and did a lot around lean in Japan. He says, in God we trust, all else bring data. And I think it's absolutely spot on. This is your first way. Get data. Data can be opinionated, of course, but it is at least a start towards avoiding biases. Socratic methods like the whys, very important. Keep going with those. Really try and understand, often the presenting issue is not the issue that really deserves attention. So playing those games with your teams and yourself to understand why. Has anyone seen World War Z, the film? Yeah. Quite a lot of zombies in it. Interestingly, there's an agile lesson in that. It's called the 10th person, and they really use this thinking technique in Israel. The deal is that if you're in a room and there is agreement of everyone, there's likely to be groupthink. There's likely to be conformity bias. So it is the responsibility of one person to deliberately disagree. Now, you don't need 10 people to do this, of course, and actually you'll probably get quite a lot of enthusiasm for being the disagreeer. But it's worth doing. If you think you spot groupthink, step back and say, all right, let's try and break this. 6 thinking hats. Has anyone heard of thinking hats? A couple of people. All right, so this deserves a lot more attention, but this is a bit I'm going to have to skim because we started late. Edward de Bono, who you see here, invented the thinking hat system a good number of decades ago now, but he said this: it may well be the most important change in human thinking for the last 2,300 years. He is a man comfortable with his own awesomeness. A bit of a bias, yeah. So who's heard of it? Thank you. And who's done it? So this is interesting. This is what we always see. A lot more people have heard of it than done this. And that leads me to the next bias, which is the bizarreness effect. We remember bizarre stuff. Those things stick. So had he called it something like coordinated thinking methods for groups, that would have just passed us by. But by talking about hats, by introducing novelty, we remember it. And if you think about things that you take away from the conference, you think about the things that stick when you're trying to bring change to your teams, a little bit of novelty will help. That's why, or rather, it's the same concept that means that acronyms that are words, and hence the popularity of backronyms, finding the word and then working out what it stands for, is because it's bizarre and novel. So we remember it. There are 2 concepts in the thinking hats that it would be worth taking away. The first one is a thinking map. What you do is get all the thinkers together, and rather than jumping in with solutions and ideas straight away, you try and collaboratively draw a map of the thinking terrain that you want to go through. So here is obviously a map of Dartmoor. We can see lots of useful stuff on here to tell us about prospective routes. So if we had gathered a bunch of people and tried to build this map collaboratively, we might have said, there's Plymouth down here, it's really busy, the traffic is atrocious. There's a big hill here, there's a fast road that goes all the way around. And then we can make choices about destinations. You all know how maps work, so I'm not going to go into that in great detail. But the point is, we often go into our meetings without this. Often what happens is someone will say, the best way to go from Plymouth to Morton Hampstead is around here. And the other person will go, nah, you go over the moors because it's nice and sunny and you can look at the hills. All right, but what happens when it's foggy? What happens when there's floods? And what happens when there's cows all over the hills? They're both useful suggestions, but the point is the meeting will then generally go into scrapping about solution. So concept 1 is a thinking map. The second concept, and this is where the hats come in, is parallel thinking. So De Bono illustrates it in this manner. If you imagine a person standing here with a walkie-talkie and another person standing on this side with a walkie-talkie, and they are told to describe the house. Now they can only see one side each, one facade each. So this person is probably going to say, oh, it's amazing, it's got a large number of windows, 3 apex roofs, a dramatic porchway. And this person on this side is going to go, what the heck? No, it hasn't. There's no door. There's a limited number of windows and there's only 2 apexes. And they won't agree because they're looking at different perspectives. So what De Bono suggests is that we walk around a problem, walk around a decision together and think in the same perspective, which is not unlike getting both the people with the walkie-talkies to stand in the same place and agree what the house looks like from this angle, and then agree what the house looks like from this angle. It's a concept he calls parallel thinking. And again, this is not what we do frequently when we go into a room full of people. The hats then are used as an entry ritual to encourage a way of thinking, but also to have a visual cue as to what style of thinking is being used at present. It also depersonalizes it slightly. So if I say, stop being such a pessimist to someone, that's pretty rude, right? There's a lot of judgment, it's a personal slight, they may not consider themselves a pessimist, etc., etc. But if I were to say something like, Black hat thinking is later. In other words, we're going to look at the bad points behind this idea later on, or some of the things that could go wrong. That feels much better because it's just saying save that thinking for later rather than you're a moaning mini. All right, I'm just thinking about timing. Do we have break next? Does anyone mind? Okay, right. Okay, do you mind giving me just 3 minutes and I will try and wrap up? So there is a blue hat. That is about thinking. So that's how we decide to process our meetings. There is a white hat, find data. Remember, we're all wearing these together. There's a creative hat, which is new ideas and alternatives. So it's not necessarily positive thinking. It's about, all right, well, what else could we do? Can we find any other solutions? Again, groupthink, we reach a conclusion, we all tend to stick to that, and we turn our brains off. Sometimes called creative loafing. What this is about is challenge ourselves. Well, what else is there? Let's have another idea. Instead of focusing on one, let's generate 3. Yellow hat is positive and constructive. So green, new ideas. Yellow, what works about this idea? This is quite rare, actually. We're really good at finding things that won't work very well and finding risk, or at least we think we find risk. The yellow hat is about, well, what could work? Red hat. Red hat is about emotions. It's very quick, but it's really useful and actually really nice if you're not familiar with it to ask a room about their emotions and just get a check-in, get their instinct, because often those instincts are valuable, but there often isn't a place made for it in our thinking and in our meetings. Black hat, everyone's favourite. Cautious, careful, what are the risks, what could go wrong? And again, often this is the hat everyone's wearing when they come into meetings. They're ready to push this stuff down. Now, the thinking hats is, so I really can't do it justice in the time available. Bits of it are really useful, so you don't need to do like a whole framework of it. Just the thought of the map, if you recognise people aren't being constructive in their thinking, is really useful. And just the thought of orchestrating thinking. Let's think in this way together, then this way, then this way. But it's also really good for coaching, because coaching is kind of a facilitated conversation with yourself, right? And so you can use the cat, or you can use the hats. You can say, right, this is a difficult decision. Why don't I try to encourage myself to look at the facts? Now think creatively about it and work through the hats on your own. It's so easy to find this online, right? So you won't have any problem if you want to learn more. All right, let's see if we can wrap this up in some way. There's 4 reasons why you have biases, right? Speed, reducing the need to store data, to look for meaning, and the sheer volume of data that comes into our brains. This is the Cognitive Bias Codec. It's well worth looking up. It describes all the biases and roughly categorizes them into the 4 sections. The 4 sections come from Kahneman, but this is like a revised version. Head here instead of Wikipedia, I'd recommend. It makes it much more digestible. We talked about that only recently, so I don't need to go through that again. They help or hinder us. I hope I've made that case. They're not inherently bad, but it's well worth being aware of them. I'm going to have to skip the Lego bit, which is a great shame. Did you know there's a Lego pain assessment scale for anyone who's stood on a Lego brick? If you want to hear... It's always 10, yeah, that's right, yeah. Which is a great example of the information bias, right? It's always 10, but they still spent time creating these.
That's just nightmare skill.
That's right, yeah. Yeah, so sorry, we'll have to skip that. So here's my closing thought, really. We don't see things as they are. We see them as we are. Thank you very much.